Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I did an earlier video on my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, on the fact that the average value of the pieces is not exactly 1, 3, 3, 5, 9 like you learn in the beginner books. It's not because the average value is position dependent. That's why we use the word average. Yes, the value of a piece is extremely position dependent, but there is an average value over all positions, and it's not 1, 3, 3, 5, 9. And if you haven't seen my preliminary video on that, you can watch that first if you'd like to. You don't have to. It's not required to watch this video. But I thought I'd show you a couple examples that show you how, wrong those values can be if you rely on them too heavily. So one of the things I asked a student to do this morning is I said, let's take the start of a chess game, and one side's going to be without a piece and the other side's going to be without 3 pawns. I said normally white has about a 2/10 of a pawn advantage in an opening. I said let's let black have his pick of which pieces you want to get rid of, the ones that'll be the most advantageous to black. So I said to him, what would you like to take off the board? And he said, I'll take the black king bishop off the board. And I said, which 3 white pawns would you like to take off the board? You could take any ones you want. So he immediately picked the F pawn because he knew that would weaken the king. And then he ended up picking the A and the B pawns. So here we are. And then I said to him, all right, I haven't turned on the engine yet. When I turn on the engine, do you think it's going to say that white has a bigger than normal 0.2 advantage or a smaller than normal? And he said, I think white's going to have a little bit smaller than normal advantage. And I said, okay, and then I turned on the engine like this. And boy, was he surprised. The engine says that now white's advantage, where he starts the game where black doesn't have a bishop and he doesn't have 3 of his pawns, is not 0.2, but 3.4. So this tells us a lot of things. It tells us you can't trust the Reinfeld numbers, the 1, 3, 3, 5, 9. I call them Reinfeld in honor of Fred Reinfeld, who wrote a lot of books in the mid-20th century, a lot of beginner books. You can't trust the Reinfeld numbers that much, but it also tells you that early in the game, the pawns aren't worth quite as much. If this was the end of the game and I said to you, would you rather have an endgame where you have a king and 3 pawns or an endgame where you have a king and a bishop? Well, that's kind of a silly question because you can't checkmate with a king and a bishop unless the pawns self-mate the king. But the 3 pawns could easily beat the bishop if one of them can go down and promote. So, of course, at the very end of the game, you'd rather have a king and 3 pawns against a king and a bishop. But the exact opposite is true at the start of the game, as you could see from this evaluation of 3.4, which is at the start of the game, the bishop can combine with the other pieces and go around and win the pawns and win material and make threats that can't be stopped. So at the start of the game, it's much, much, much better to have the extra piece. Now you might say, yeah, but it's a bishop and white has the bishop pair and so on. And well, okay, you'd be slightly right. Let's turn off the evaluation. Let's create a new one. And let's put the bishop back on the board. And let's take off a knight. Which one you want to take off? I don't know. Take off the king knight so you can castle quicker. All right, let's create this positions, create chapter. And okay, is white going to be head 3.4? Well, maybe not. White no longer has the advantage of the bishop pair, which is half a pawn. Do you think he can get up to 2.9? Let's take a look. Mr. Stockfish, what do you think? Stockfish says, white's about a pawn worse than he was before, but he's still way, way, way above the average advantage for white in the opening, which is 0.2. He's up at like 2.2, which means if both sides played perfectly, white would win every time. So even in this situation, which is slightly better for black than the previous situation, it's still gigantically good for white. And trading 3 pawns for the knight was not a fair trade. Winning the knight for the 3 pawns was tremendously advantageous for the person who won the knight. Now, how does this happen in games? Well, let's look at a game that happened in our chess club this week. We'll go through the whole, well, I don't have the whole game here, but I guess I could show you the whole game. Let me create a new chapter. Starting position, orientation, we'll look from black. Okay, I think the game went something like this. D4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, e3, bishop e7, knight f3, castle. Whoop, did he miss my move? Knight f3, castle, bishop d3, pawn takes, bishop takes, b6, castle, bishop b7. Now white played the slow move a3, c5, knight e2 to overprotect d4, pawn takes, knight takes, queen c7 to hit the bishop. Here white should play queen e2 maybe to guard the bishop. b3 isn't terrible. The engine said it wasn't that bad, but I wouldn't have done that. b3, white plays rook to d8. Black played bishop d2 to get out of the pin, but a better way to get out of the pin would be to move the queen again to e2 to move your queen to a closed file where it can't be harassed by rooks. Queen to e2. He played bishop d2, and white played knight c6. All right, let's turn off the engine. Okay, so white looked at this position and he said, I know my Reinfeld numbers, those 1, 3, 3, 5, 9s. I can take this pawn with my bishop, and then if I'm winning a pawn and if he wants to get my bishop with pawn takes, I can play knight takes and I'll fork his queen and his rook, and then when he moves the queen, I'll take the rook, and I'll end up with a rook and 2 pawns against a bishop and a knight. And therefore I will have one point by Reinfeld values. So that's a good combination for me. All right, so what do you think? Bishop takes e6. Is that good for white, bad for white, or neutral? You could stop the video, you can pause the video, and come up with your own answer. Is bishop takes e6 a good move, a bad move, or it's kind of neutral, doesn't affect the game much? All right, well, again, if you had time to pause it, you can pause as long as you want, but let's keep going. I will play bishop takes e6. We're not going to turn on the engine yet. So in this position, black decided, rather than taking the bishop right away, let me trade knights, which actually is a pretty good idea. So he took with a knight, and of course, white has to take back with a knight, so he has a knight to fork with. So he takes with a knight. Now, here, black has 2 ways to lose the rook for the knight. He could take the bishop, and then after knight takes, he could move the queen, and then the knight could take the rook. Or he can take the knight right away, and if white takes the rook, then black will take the bishop. So black should probably make use of his desperado bishop and play check, and then take here. So white could get this position if he wanted. Or white could take the bishop. Well, or he could ignore it completely. So again, before we go through all the answers here, you could pause the video and figure out what would you do for black. Would you A, counterattack and not take the bishop? B, take the bishop? Or C, take the knight, let the bishop sacrifice itself for a pawn, and then he'll take back? Which of the 3 would you do? All right, well, in the game, black was spooked out by this, and he said, well, I'm down a pawn, and if I take the bishop and he takes back, he's hitting my queen and my rook, and I get 2 pieces for a rook and a pawn, and then I'll be down 2 pawns because of the one I already lost. So I'll be down a pawn, but I'm down a pawn already, so by Reinfeld values, I'm -1 now, and if I take the bishop and he forks me, I'm -1 again. So he said, I may as well not take it, I may as well counterattack, and he played bishop to c5 in the game. Okay, what did you choose? Well, if you choose pawn takes bishop and the knight takes, black has a move he could play, queen c6, attacking the knight and attacking the pawn on g2. Now white can't take the rook at all because he'll get checkmated. In fact, the double attack on the knight and the king means that white has to play knight to f4 to guard the mate. But now white is just down a piece for 2 pawns. But also black has a tactic here. What could black play? Well, black could play something like g5 to remove the guard. And a lot of my students are like, oh no, you can't open up your king, you'll get mated. Well, you're not getting mated here. What you're doing is winning a knight for a pawn. If white moves the rook over, and attacks the queen can probably not go to e4 because of f3. That's a little awkward, but the queen can go to d7. And now we're hitting the bishop and we're hitting the knight. And one of them's probably got to fall. Okay, so this is going to be completely winning. But suppose black couldn't do that. Suppose white takes here, and black takes here, and white takes the rook, and black takes. Now white has what he started out for. White has a rook and 2 pawns for the 2 pieces. Who is this good for? Again, before I turn on the engine, evaluate this, and then we'll go back and we'll turn on the engine for all of these and come to some conclusions. All right, let's go back and do that now. So do you think white's better here? Do you think white got enough? The 2 pieces, got the rook and 2 pawns was enough? Let's take a look. Let's go back to the start. All right, at the very start, the engine says that black has a good position and he's up by about 9/10 of a pawn. When white plays bishop takes e6, that goes from 9/10 of a pawn to minus 5.7. So if you thought bishop takes e6 was a good move, or at least a neutral move, to get the rook and the 2 pawns for the 2 pieces, you can see that's not true. But it says black should start out by taking that knight, which is what he did. White, of course, will take back. If white wants to take the pawn already, then black's got what he wants, because white's not going to be winning any exchanges here. And in this line, after king takes f7, knight takes d4, the engine has black, even though white has 2 pawns for the piece, black is up by about 6 pawns here, 5.8. So of course white took back with the knight in the game. And now this is where black played bishop c5. Let's see how good a move it is. Right now it says if black plays perfectly, he's up 7.6. Bishop c5, look at that. By not taking and being spooked out by that fork, he drops from ahead 7 pawns to only ahead by 0.4, which is lower than he was when he started. When black started, he was up by 0.9, and now he's only up by 0.4. If instead he plays rook takes knight, well, that's way better than what he would have done. And we suspected bishop takes, king takes, pawn takes here. And now, again, white has a rook and 2 pawns for 2 pieces. Black also has the bishop pair. If you're one of those people that just does Reinfeld counts to figure out how good you are, in this position, you would say that white is up a pawn or up a point, depending on whether you like points or pawns. Well, white may be up a point according to the Reinfeld numbers, but according to the engine, black is up by 3.3, which is enough to win every game without too much trouble. So black's just killing white here because his pieces are so active and they're so strong, and those extra pawns are not going to get rolling in the endgame anytime soon. In fact, we're never going to get to an endgame where those pawns will come rolling down the board because the middle game is all for black here. All right, let's go back. But suppose you take the bishop. And now the engine says you're up by 7.5 pawns. This is what I told my students to do after the game on Tuesday. I said, this is what you should have done. And black says, well, I was worried about this fork. And white said, yeah, I'm forking him. Well, first of all, I pointed out this queen c6 move, which leaves black up by 8.4 pawns. And in fact, it says after knight f4, it doesn't even want to play g5. That's only 7.7 pawns. It wants to play knight e4 to try to harass this bishop, which could only be guarded by the rook here. But suppose black didn't have that. Suppose there was no mate thread here. Suppose queen c6 double attacking didn't work. And suppose black just moves his queen to e5 and lets white take the rook, and white takes back. Sorry, black takes back. Well, again, we've reached a position where white has a rook and 2 pawns for the 2 pieces, and black has the bishop pair. If we go by Reinfeld numbers, white's up by 1 point. If we throw in a half a pawn for the bishop pair, white's up by half a point. But none of those is even close to the truth. The truth is that black is up by 5.1 because his pieces are monster here, and those pawns are never going to do anything. the pieces are going to do everything here. They're going to attack things more times than they can be defended. You saw that earlier example where I traded the knight or the bishop for the 3 pawns at the start of the game, and it jumped tremendously in how much the side up a piece for the 3 pawns was winning. This is actually a very, very similar thing. I did it in a raw case on the first move of the game to show you what the idea is, but in all of these kind of positions, the pieces are just going to beat the pawns here early in the game. Again, if it's a late endgame, and it's the only pieces on the board are a rook and 2 pawns against 2 pieces, well, obviously you'd rather have a rook and 2 pawns against 2 pieces if the 2 pieces have no pawns, because the 2 pieces by themselves can't beat the rook, and the rook and the 2 pawns, who knows, depending on where the pawns are, might be able to beat the bishop and knight. But much earlier in the game, that's not true, so you have to be careful about these average values. And, I see people making these mistakes all the time. If we go back to the original position, where white played bishop takes e6, let's take the lines off the board. In this position, bishop takes e6 is trading 2 of the most active pieces, the knight on d4 and the bishop on c4, for a couple pawns that are not doing very much. They're okay. And then even if you get the rook on d8, the recapture of the other rook onto the d file. So what you're actually doing is losing a bunch of tempos. White's already behind in development. You can see the best move here is the move that I talked about earlier, which is queen e2. Putting the queen on a closed file so the rooks can't get to it, getting out of the way of all these potential pins. And if white does that, he's still a little behind in development. He's down by about 0.9, but there's still a game to be played. But when you go by these Reinfeld things and you go, oh my goodness, I get 2 pawns and a rook for a bishop and a knight, I'm +1, that should be winning for me. That's just wrong for several reasons. One reason is those numbers just are not very accurate. 2, they're averages, and in this particular position, the instantaneous value of the pieces is far different than what those averages are. But 3, those averages are over the entire game. Early in the game, the pawns are worth less, the pieces are worth more, and you can make really, really big mistakes by doing that. So again, let's show those numbers. Right now it's 0.9 for black. Bishop takes, it jumps to 5.7. Knight takes, good move. Knight takes. And now if you take the bishop, you're up 7.6. Even if you don't have queen c6 and you have queen e5, you're going to be up 5 pawns, which is more than any other move. If you play rook takes knight, bishop takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, that's a slightly less good version. Instead of being up 5 pawns, you're only up 3.3. If you do what white did in the game, what black did in the game, and get spooked by this and say, oh, I don't want to be forked, I'll just go here, and now I'm attacking the bishop and I'm attacking the knight. And here I think white played, I can't remember if white played rook to c1. Might have played rook to c1. Rook c1, engine likes. And now again, you could take the bishop, but I don't think he did. He probably moved the queen. And the bishop came back. I forget how the exact game went. And then he ended up winning the pawn. And now white should just move the bishop to get out of the pin. White made a move that loses the game. He played rook to c2 to guard the bishop. Well, you don't want to guard things. If you haven't watched my video on the 5 ways to make a piece safe, usually the best way to make a piece safe if you can't capture the attacking piece is to just move the piece, and this is no exception. Moving the bishop over here would give white a playable game. Sure, black's still better. He's up, in development, but white has the bishop pair. But instead of just doing that, and I think when I asked white after the game, why didn't you play bishop e3? It's such the obvious move. He said, I didn't want to make a lot of trades here. And that's, again, kind of playing chess with one hand tied behind your back. The answer is, well, some positions, like if you're down in material, you don't want to make trades. But here, white's not down in material. He might be less in the evaluation after queen to e4 threatening mate, but he's not down in material. So, he wants to just, I guess the engine likes this move better because of the mate threats. But the point is, he wants to just move the bishop. You can't just tie your hands behind your back and say, well, I don't like to trade queens in chess, so I'm going to keep my queens on the board. I'm going to play rook c2. If you're down a knight or something, well, okay, that might make some sense. But to just play it this way and play rook c2, now he's in a nasty pin because the queen is only guarded once and it's going to be attacked twice on the d file. And all black had to do was play knight to e4, and it's the ball game. Because we just piled up on the bishop and there's no more pieces to guard it, you can't block the attacks. And now if you move it, he takes the queen. So knight e4 would have won the game. Unfortunately, black saw that idea, but for some reason miscounted, and instead he put his bishop on e4, which is a terrible move too, because now that rook, which is guarding the bishop, can continue to guard the bishop from the a2 square, and that bishop on e4 is blocking the knight, and now black's advantage has dropped all the way back down to 0.4. And what white should do on the next couple moves is just kind of get his queen out of the pin by playing a move like queen to e2. In the game, black went on and eventually did win the game when white eventually allowed that pin to win the bishop. He never did move the queen out of the way. But I wanted to show the entire sequence because this idea of playing bishop e6, I go to the club a lot and I watch a lot of the amateur games there, and this idea that people rely so strongly on the exact Reinfeld numbers and they make moves like this, and yes, can they work sometimes? I'm not telling you should never do this. I'm not telling you that a knight and the bishop is always worth more than a rook and two pawns, but an awful lot of the time, the rook and the two pawns are at least equal to the knight and the bishop are at least equal to the rook and the two pawns. I once heard an anecdote that world champion Michael Tal said when he played the other grandmasters, he liked to look for positions where he could sacrifice two pieces and get a rook and a pawn. Why did he do that? Well, he said because two pieces are worth really less than a rook and a pawn, even though the Reinfeld values are equal. And all the other, Soviet grandmasters knew that a bishop and a knight was worth more than a rook and a pawn. So if Tal could give up a knight and a bishop and get a rook for a pawn, a rook and a pawn, they would always let him do it because they would assume it must be bad just because of the piece values. So Tal was looking for situations where he could make that kind of sacrifice in order to get some sort of an attack, because he figured they would let him do it. I guess he kind of hinted that it was very rare that he actually could find such a situation where giving up two pieces for a rook and a pawn actually turns out to be really good. And of course, there's always counter examples and exceptions to these things. But, the fact that he was saying he knew they would always give him the rook and the pawn for the two pieces tells you that everybody knew that those Reinfeld values were not correct, that like a bishop and a knight is almost always worth more than a rook and a pawn, even though it's 6-6 with the Reinfeld values. All right, so if you haven't seen the other video on, I think the name of the other video is something like the average value of the pieces is not 13359. That's sort of it's not a prerequisite for this one, but it is sort of a more basic thing. But I wanted to show it, in practicality here in this example. Okay, so if you enjoyed the video, you can hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, you can do that. And as I tell everybody, the number one thing you can do with the videos that can help is word of mouth. Tell your chess friends about my channel. I've got almost every single possible idea you could have on improving in chess. And how do I know that? Because I've taught people for, I hate to say it, about half a century, over a quarter of a century full time. And the same problems that they run into over and over and over and over again that cause them to be weaker and that hold them back are the same things that fuel the content of my videos. So sure, I'm sure somebody teaching you how to play the Caro-Kann is going to get a lot of hits, a lot of views on their videos. But if you want to get better, the things that cause people, that hold them back, that cause people to not be as good as they could be, I cover a lot of that over and over again from many different angles in my channel. That's what my channel specializes in. So please tell your friends about it. Thanks. I appreciate it when you do. All right. For my channel, this is Dan Heisman. We'll see you next time. Bye.